Well, good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to welcome you this evening to the prestigious 2023 Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecture. It's fantastic that we can all get together virtually for this really special event, and it's great to have so many of you joining us. We think this is going to break all records tonight, so thank you for being part of that. And although we may not be able to see each other face to face, you can use the chat tab to connect with each other and the questions tab to submit questions to our Casson lecturer, because later on we'll have a time for a short Q&A session. So first held in 1973, this annual lecture is held in honour of Dr. Elizabeth Casson and her fantastic contribution to the occupational therapy profession. She was the first woman awarded a medical degree from the University of Bristol in 1919, and Dr. Casson introduced occupational therapy to England, and then in 1929 established the first occupational therapy school, Dorton House in Bristol. So in recognition of Dr. Elizabeth Casson's commitment to further occupational therapy, we award the lectureship to an RCOT member whose peers consider them to have made and to be making a significant contribution to the profession's development. And our lecture is an opportunity for the chosen speaker to talk about a topic important to them, to the profession, and actually to the wider world as well. So in their personal and professional capacities, I'd like to invite now Alice Hortop, who's the professional lead and program lead for the occupational therapy apprenticeship degree at the University of the West of England, and Chrissy Ward, who's a community mental health occupational therapy apprentice at Wolverhampton University, to introduce the 2023 Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecturer.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to introduce Keir Harding with fellow nominator Chrissy Ward for this momentous lecture. Occupational therapy is a fortunate profession. We contribute uniquely to health and well-being, and amongst us we have many luminaries. Our luminaries shine bright in practice, academia, and expert by experience, lighting a fire in the belly of our practice. If passion and inspiration are contagious sparks, we felt Keir Harding could ignite our profession for the forthcoming years. Your presence is proof of his ability to garner excitement and rouse a community to gather on such a vast scale. There's actually over 3,400 of you here. Here's a brief introduction to his career. Keir graduated as an OT in 1999 from Brunel University, the year of the Matrix, and many other fantastic things. He began working in the traditional mental health services, but he felt the setting did not feel a fit. After a few years, he was working in a therapeutic community where their collaborative approach aligned with his sense of justice and provided opportunities to challenge the stigmas that commonly come with labelling people. Keir published his work in OT News, hoping to inspire people that we can work differently. And he won a National Practice Prize Award in 2010 called Citizens at the Centre of Service Design and Delivery. And he also won a Trust Personal Prize of Outstanding Achievement Award. Despite this success, longer term, Keir's work was not supported by his managers. He proactively searched for his next role as a specialist clinician, and in 2012 he further trained as a dialectical behavioural therapist, DBT. He set up another therapeutic community and successfully completed his Masters in Personality Disorder from the Institute of Mental Health in Nottingham. In 2016, they were the only mental health team shortlisted for another National Practice Award. He used his continuing professional development with his experiences to gain a specialist role in a personality disorder team. He left the NHS after feeling his master's knowledge that he gained could not be fully used in this setting. He set up his own company, Being Consultancy. Braving the leap to independent practice allows him greater freedom to advocate for his clients, and he estimates saving the NHS up to 200,000 for each person he works with. The reason at the heart of our nominations go beyond Keir's impressive CV. Kier tenaciously fights for the rights of people labelled with personality disorder at a national and local level. He built a social media following to campaign for better treatment, particularly targeting the export of traumatised young women into private hospitals. He frequently blogs, vlogs, posts, tweets, publishes, interviews, and presents in his mission to raise the voices of this marginalised, stigmatised community. He actively seeks to put the voice of the people he works with at the centre of his work. He wrote the first chapter in the book Personality Disorder and co-wrote the second edition with expert by experience Holly Berrigan. He's written chapters in books, been interviewed in the mainstream media, is active at conferences, and his podcast with colleague Holly, The Wrong Kind of Mad, has a 5-star rating. Kier is enigmatic, an ambassador for occupational therapy. He sweeps people along with him. He could be misconstrued as empire building, but when we wrote an article together promoting the profession, his passion for raising occupational therapy for all our practices came through strongly. He talks to everyone about occupational therapy, not just occupational therapists, evidenced by his influential article in The Lancet. He supports others to rise, always publicly recognising the good works of others, and shares his failings equally with his wins. Thank you for always bolstering me, Kier. When Steve Ford met him, he invited Kier to talk on the OTs for Equity panel and share his practice with RCOT staff. Kier was fundamental in overturning the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, so NICE, decision not to have an OT on their panel to review the NICE guidelines for self-harm. But for me personally, I was most touched by his challenge of an occupational therapy textbook that promoted disrespectful and potentially damaging treatment of its client community. He persevered despite a backlash from some occupational therapists concerned with the author's feelings rather than the potential harmful consequences for the clients. I know from personal conversations he did not like having to challenge the book. It was clearly stressful and unpleasant. He acted in accordance with his morality despite the unpleasantness, and thankfully the edition was removed from circulation. Bravo, comrade. I'd like to now hand over to Chrissy Ward, fabulous co-nominator. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Evening to all of you, and thank you for this opportunity to be part of this special event. When I was asked to introduce Kier, I didn't know where I would start. There was so much. I thought about all of the fabulous achievements. However, I quickly realised that my reason for nominating Kier was something else. It was Kier's willingness to share his imperfect journey to becoming the occupational therapist he is today. He didn't start as the loud and proud OT we now know, but he had a career journey with ups and downs and hurdles along the way. Kier encouraged and united 500 occupational therapy assistants and students to sign a letter to the National Institute of Clinical Excellence in 2019 to drive forward the need for occupational therapy to be represented in the review of the guidelines for self-harm. This was successful, and occupational therapy has a voice in this guidance. In a nutshell, Kier has shown a whole generation of OTs that being a pioneer and a trailblazer in OT is accessible and a possibility. And finally, he's shown us that OT has a voice and it can be heard. I now have the great pleasure in handing over to 2023's Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecturer, Keir Harding.
Helo, ei croeso I darlith gotha Elizabeth Casson 2023. Mae hyn yn fwy o Gymraeg nad ydw I eriog wedi siarad yn fy mwydd. Hello, good evening, and welcome to the 2023 Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecture. That is more Welsh than I have ever spoken in my life. Now, The observant among you will have noticed that this has been plugged as nothing grows in toxic environments. And you'll notice that my first slide has got a great big tree on it, obviously growing. So maybe it's that things do grow in toxic environments, but they might not grow in the way that leads them to be as healthy and as they could have been. We're going to go with nothing thrives in toxic environments. It is a privilege and an honour and a source of bafflement to be invited to give this lecture to you today. It's wonderful to be able to be in Wales delivering it. The house of Elizabeth Casson is probably about 30 miles away, the house where Elizabeth Casson was born. And it's wonderful to be here in Wrexham. You might have seen Welcome to Wrexham. That's become suddenly more famous. But in Wrexham, in Wales, home of the Welsh rugby team, home of the Welsh government. And in a country that really punches above its weight in terms of creativity and passion and song, with some people who've made massive contributions to healthcare in the UK. Now, I'm wondering a bit about what it is that led me to be invited to give this lecture. And if I look back on some of the people who've done this before me, and I see Dr. Sydney Chew, Dr. Jenny Preston, Dr. Sarah Cantazeskis, Dr. Nick Pollard, Dr. Anita Atwell, Professor Diane Cox, Dr. Wendy Bryant, and me, Mr. Keir Harding. Maybe there was an appetite for something to be a bit different, maybe something that's a little bit less academic and something that's a bit more from the cold face, and maybe something that would diverge from previous lectures. And who better to bring a new and diverged perspective than a middle-aged, middle-class white man? If I look back to the founding of the Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecture, I found that actually the first 5 lecturers were all men, and 40% of them were called Hugh. Now, I'm not called Hugh, but we will see. We will see if there is something different in what we're talking about today. Now, for those of you who don't know, and I'm not going to pretend that I knew before I got invited to do this, Elizabeth Casson was a Welsh woman who laid the foundation for occupational therapy in the United Kingdom. She was born in 1881 in Denbigh in North Wales, not that far from me. And she grew up at a time when women still suffered extreme discrimination within society. She was a pioneer and a free thinker, and somebody who wouldn't be placed into a box defined by her characteristics or her title. She became the first woman to be awarded a Doctorate of Medicine from the University of Bristol in 1926. Now, as I go through this lecture, I'm going to end up talking about myself a fair bit, which is probably partly evidence of my rampant narcissism, but also my master's degree really encouraged a lot of introspection and thinking about how does it affect you, what are you feeling, and how does what you feel influence what you do. So if I talk about myself a lot, it's because of that. It's, you know, I was taught to do that. And I do think there's a value in us being quite self-aware and knowing how our thoughts and feelings impact on ourselves and the people around us. But I'm pretty aware that I am not a randomized controlled trial. So anything that's coming from me today, it's just opinion, and other opinions are available. So I'm just going to invite you to think about some of the things that I'm talking about and not to take them as facts, but maybe use them to rub up against some of the things that you might think already, some things you might think you agree with me on already, and we'll just see where we come from. But remember, other opinions are available. Now, I like to pretend that the model of human occupation is the one that I use most often because, you know, it's the most useful, it's the one that's most natural fit with the way I kind of shape the way that I do my work. In reality, this is the only model that I can talk about with any sense of competence. So it's one that I use a lot. But I think there's some useful things that we can get across to people quite simply. So in occupational therapy, when we are using the model of human occupation, we take the idea that humans have got an innate need to act, to do things, to not just be static, but to move, to create, to do the things that need to be done. It breaks down into 4 different areas. So we've got the things that we want to do, our volition, the things that we need to do, our habituation, the skills that we have in order to be able to do those things. And then around us, we've got an environment that can put a different pressure that can either inhibit us trying to do the things that we want to do, or can really help out. Now, Keir Harding breaks down the environment into a couple of different things. He talks about, I mean, you can read this slide for yourself, but the things that I'm most concerned about are the spaces within which people do things, the social groups around us, the culture that informs us, and the political and economic context that influences the way that we think and do things. Now, if I have a road accident tonight, if I lose the use of my bottom limbs, I'm going to be hard pressed to stop an occupational therapist coming into my house, fitting grab rails, sticking ramps up to the door, maybe getting me a lift upstairs. We have the idea that environments can be adapted. But do we do that the same in social environments? Do we do that as much in mental health? I don't think that we do. I don't think we do. So a lot of what we're talking about this evening is whether we have enough awareness about social environments and whether we need to be trying to adapt those more. We do it in physical health. Do we do it so much in mental health? So probably the most obvious social environment that we have in our work is our relationship with the people that we're working with. Now, I often talk about spending my days as a bad student and my early career as a fairly bad occupational therapist, and some would say that I'm still there. But there were people that I worked with who had lived through incredible trauma, whose life had taught them that they were worthless, that they should be dead, and they acted as if that was the case. Now, university prepared me to work with people who would come to me with a problem, very gratefully take my advice, go off and do what was suggested, and then maybe come back and say thank you for making it all better. I think that was my very childish notion of what being an occupational therapist was be like. When people had goals that didn't fit with what I thought that I was there for, when people didn't recognise my inherent goodness and wisdom and thought that I might hurt them like other people in their life had, I found that really difficult. And I think I resented them for not responding in the way that I thought that they should. It was really easy to believe that the patients I was working with were the attention-seeking manipulators that my peers and betters told me that they were people who had the power to split teams, who were dangerous to connect with because they would make me collude with them, they would burn me out. And it was much more appealing to believe this than consider that there might be some failing in me, there might be some failing in what I was offering. There might be something about how I approached people, in what I expected of them, in what the service was there to be doing. Now, in retrospect, I think I was there to help people who were really experiencing difficulties with their mental health, but I wasn't getting the right patients. And that was a real problem. That was a massive problem that I thought, and was helped to think that the people coming in through the door were just not quite the right people. And when I thought about that, or when I thought like that, it's really interesting to think about the social environment that I would bring into the work. So how can I help people if I'm seeing them as undeserving of care? How can I help people if their experiences of anger or their experiences and responses to injustice are clinically designated as inappropriate? How can I be helpful to people if their ways of coping that might cause problems for them are seen as kind of pathology and part of illness rather than occupations with meaning and value that can be understood? So I don't think that was very helpful to people. And at the time, I thought of these, and the system around me thought of these ways of being as maybe just morally bad to be judged. At that time, I came across Rebecca Twinley's work talking about the dark side of occupation. And that was really helpful for me because it moved from things that should be judged and disapproved of to things that could be understood and thought about. And from that, you could then think about how you might help people. I was working with people who had had power taken away from them in the most humiliating and painful ways. And I approved as it happened again in services. And when people reacted to services once again taking power away in humiliating and painful ways, when they reacted to that in a way that I might have reacted to it if it was me, I saw that as a sign of kind of moral failing and illness. And my colleagues helped me to do this. And again, I'm going to suggest that this is not a helpful way to work with people. It's the quality of the relationship that we have that is going to make a difference. It doesn't really matter what else we do. If our relationship is good, then that's what's going to bring out results. And the environment that I was working in was making therapeutic relationships near impossible. And it was blaming the patients for making them so difficult. Now, another thing that makes relationships hard is the idea that we have the patients on the one side and the staff on the other. And the patients are a bit mad and the staff are bastions and role models of sanity. And I think we can all probably understand that this is quite the nonsense. We might notice that there's a lot of bad backs in mental health care. We might notice that our colleagues disappear. I mean, I've had to come away from work sometimes. I've struggled with my own mental health. I grew up and went through my teenage years trying to avoid pretty much any situation where people could judge me or think that I was stupid. There's been times in my life where I thought, do you know, I don't know if life is worth living, and kind of made plans around that. But in work, we have this real kind of division that we're all well, we're all right. The people who aren't well are on the other side of the reception desk. And I think that's really damaging to staff. I think it makes our relationships very disingenuous. Whereas I think if we could admit that we all struggle and that there isn't some magic wand that makes everybody all right once they walk through the doors and into the staff office of the mental health building, then we're okay. If we can recognise that we're all struggling together, I think that makes our relationships a lot more genuine. But there's other things that can make our relationships difficult. So in my work with people who often get the label or diagnosis of personality disorder, that can cause problems from the start because they're people who often feel and act as if life isn't worth living. And the difficulty of being given a label like personality disorder is that people start to treat you as if you have a disordered personality. People forget about what has happened to you in your life and they think that your problems are intrinsic to you. They become the fault of pathological personality traits rather than anything that can be fully understood. Self-harm becomes a symptom rather than a complex behaviour or an occupation that carries function and meaning. And is this a problem? Well, I think that it is. It's especially a problem when 80% of people who get a diagnosis of BPD will have lived through significant neglect, abandonment, or trauma in their lives. And while the research says 80%, in my experience, it's 100%. Everybody I work with has had these very adverse experiences in their lives. I have yet to meet anybody whose difficulties don't make perfect sense in terms of the environment that they've lived through or they're in now. And this means that when services come into contact with people who are survivors of horror, they tell them that their difficulties are because their personalities are disordered. And it's not a reaction to living in terror for years. It's not a reaction to constantly being given the message that you are worthless or undeserving. The problem's with you. We focus on the person and we forget about the stuff that goes on around. And as professions concerned about the environment, we probably need to make sure that we're not doing that. Now, in my work, I think it's an incredibly cruel thing to tell people who have lived through disordered circumstances that they are disordered themselves. But I wonder whether what I see in my work is something that happens in wider society as well. Now, one of the most basic things that we can do as occupational therapists, as clinicians, as humans, is to bring a validating and compassionate understanding to our relationships with people. Now, I used to think that the relationship grew as you did the work together, and it was only later in my career that I kind of learned that if the first goal isn't to establish a collaborative, trusting, therapeutic relationship, it doesn't really matter what goal number 2 is. And I might be overemphasizing this because I work with people who've frequently been hurt by others, who have been hurt by people like me. But for so long, I took people's mistrust of me as an affront. I thought that I could probably undo a lifetime of mistreatment by just radiating out my inherent goodness. And wow, it hurt when people were still suspicious of me. And again, I always kind of put that problem onto them rather than thinking about what a ridiculous notion it might be that I could undo all of their problems that quickly. Now, a good therapeutic relationship might be the most precious thing that we can give to people, because the foundation is what everything else is built on. Just being reliable, just being honest, just being genuine. Remembering that walking through a door and asking somebody for help can be really weird. Remembering that it might be hard to ask. Now, we can provide an environment where anything can be thought about and understood. And I definitely haven't always done that. I think in the past, my priority was sometimes to fill out the form rather than hear the information. Sometimes I decided that because the person couldn't really communicate what was wrong, that was a reason not to help rather than try and help more. I assumed that somebody who went away and didn't come back was maybe them just being kind of bloody minded, or, you know, that certainly not thinking, I wonder if I did something that I could have done better in that session. And for a long time, it was really important to preserve the idea that I was working really well. I was doing stuff that was really useful. And again, it was just the wrong patients. The people weren't doing what they needed to get the best out of me. And I forgot about some of the things that got in the way of relationships being easy. And this slide we've got up at the moment that I haven't mentioned as I've been talking, but let's have a go now. You get people coming in who had multiple experiences of those who were supposed to help not being helpful and even being harmful, and multiple barriers to accessing the help that was on offer. And because I couldn't bring myself to see it any different, I saw people who just didn't turn up, people with the wrong problems for the service. I saw people doing things that I wouldn't do, so I couldn't really understand it. And I came up with some quite pejorative explanations for why they were doing it. And because I thought like that, it was really easy not to help. And even if I did help, I think the help was a bit resentful. You know, I could be working with people who were more enthusiastic or more grateful for the help that was on offer. And I couldn't get my head around why people might not be thriving in this difficult to access care that I was part of delivering. Now, there is no social environment that we can shape any easier than the relationship that we have with people. So I'm really encouraging people to work on that. The relationships that we put the most effort into, where we see the impact, those are the patients that will live in our minds forever. And I can think about a few people who've really influenced me because of relationships that we've had together. But there's other things that can make those relationships tricky, as well as the things that we bring in there. There's the work environment around us. Now, Jennifer Creek has identified a few things that mean that the occupational therapy work environment can really shape the service that we do. So it might be a bit less about what we as therapists think, this is what needs to happen, this is what needs to be delivered. The environment can shape what occupational therapy is within that organisation. It can tell us what materials we use, how long we do the work for and where we do it, how long each session lasts, and when we have to tell people to leave. And it'll also kind of define what makes a good and bad occupational therapist within that. And that might be perfectly all right, but it might not be client-centered, and it might not be holistic. I remember that I came from an occupational therapy service, and this is probably one of the things that really shaped my career. I was working in a community mental health team, and that was in secondary care services, which meant it was for people with fairly complex, often quite long-standing problems. The team was working with people who had serious risks to themselves and other people. If people were experiencing really severe problems, their input went up. It was generally a long-term intervention. There was thoughts about things that could kill you. And if people weren't motivated, people would chase them up because, you know, there was a danger to not helping people. The occupational therapy service within that team seemed really different. There was often an idea that we had to wait for people to be stable enough for therapy. You couldn't be helped until you were well enough. There was a pressure to deliver time-limited pieces of work. So regardless of whether somebody had had 20 years of suffering, there was a kind of pressure to do a 12-week piece of work to try and make a difference. While the rest of the team was focused on the things that might kill people, the things that might get people detained in hospital, the OT service pressed for a bit more of things around quality of life, healthy eating. And it doesn't mean that that's not an important thing to focus on. It just didn't seem to be the things that was imminently life-threatening or imminently threatening of people's liberty being taken away. If people didn't engage with the OT service, it wasn't that we thought about what's going on there. Why is it that this person can't access help? Let's have a think about that. It was a reason not to work with people. And it felt like we were a primary care team within the secondary mental health team. We were a team for short-term intervention for problems that could be fixed very quickly within a team that was there for the long haul, working with people who had suffered for years and years and years. And it just felt odd. It just felt like it didn't fit. It certainly felt like I didn't fit. And I definitely wanted to do something different. And part of, you know, I'd love to say that I realised this at the time, but we used to use the OCARES assessment. And one of the segments in that was people's readiness for change. You'd ask them about change in their life. You'd ask them about what happens when they do things different. You'd ask them about what's it like when people give you feedback. You know, and bear in mind, I'm often working with people whose feedback has often been violence, feedback has often been humiliation, criticism, and I'm asking them how they react to that. And then you you rate their ratings. So if people find it really hard to take feedback, if people find it really hard to identify how life can be different, you know, for a lot of people I work with, how they can even stay alive, if they were really isolated and had few opportunities to mix with other people, if they found it really hard to adjust to feedback, that was a reason for them to go. So again, people who found it hard to help, hard to access help, hard to make use of help, they weren't given help, as opposed to that being a massive priority. The only thing that could alleviate their suffering, being able to use some help. If they couldn't do it, they had to stay suffering. Oh, and that was a bit painful. That didn't quite feel right. So again, you know, I had that experience of the environment around people was suggesting that they were the wrong patients, and we couldn't be working with them. I was in a profession with the wrong patients, and that probably needed to be different. I remember my colleague saying, you know, we're in the hospital and the patients are getting discharged before they're ready for OT. And I'm thinking, you know, if we have help that you have to be well enough to access and people are leaving before they can use that help, what we are offering is not right. And I'm encouraging people to think, if that is some of your experience, how do we adjust what we're offering to make sure it's meeting the needs of the people who are walking through our door? Because for so long, I just thought they were the wrong people. And I think I let down a lot of people over those years. So as our CMHT grew smaller, because there were years of people having decent funding, but there were years of funding to services really being curtailed. I remember Jeremy Hunt telling us that we had to do more with less, and it was a good catchphrase, but the reality was we did less with less. And it was painful because there had to be a pretense that things were still okay. As our waiting lists grew, as the amount of times you would see people a month decreased, as the intensity of people's intervention fell, as the threshold for access in services went higher and higher, we had to pretend that it was still all right. And we never really said to our patients, times are tough, guys, you're not going to get the same service that you used to get. We pretended it was still all okay. And it's a really painful thing for healthcare staff to experience. Chloe Beale in that slide behind is writing about the moral industry that we sustain when we promote the idea that what is being offered is the correct thing to offer and the right thing to offer. Because certainly for me, at that time, in that environment, what we were offering felt far, far short of what me and my colleagues believed people needed. And it was painful to be a part of. And again, there's an environmental push there that's really getting in the way of our functioning as staff, but also the functioning of the people that we're supposed to be there helping. So while I was finding it difficult with that kind of dichotomy of what the CMHT was offering in terms of intensive work for people who could be dangerous to themselves, an occupational therapy service that looked a lot more at quality of life, I would say. I remember looking at this meme that talked about, you know, medicine adds days to lives, occupational therapy adds life to days. And that's brilliant. And maybe we should slide to that. But can we add days to life as well? Can we think about some of the interventions that are life-saving, not just life-changing, that can keep people in the world and not just make those days? I don't think these two things are mutually exclusive, and I'd love to see more occupational therapists really thinking about the things that can kill people, the things that can get people in hospital or prison, the things that have massive massive impacts on people's functioning. I think that we can think about those things as well. And if we don't, then it's other professions thinking about them. And maybe that's exactly the way we want it. It's not the way that I want it. So we definitely need to help people live rather than survive. But we also need to help them survive. I remember talking to Bridget Bowen of Compassionate Mental Health fairly recently. And as she'd come across people who used self-harm as a way of coping and got stuck in hospital, she was saying, you know, do occupational therapists think about the meaning of self-harm for people and why it's useful? And I said, well, I think typically it's other professions that do that. And she said to me, no, I don't think anybody does. And maybe that's the thing. Maybe there's a group of people who do things that are on the darker side of occupation, the things that traditionally aren't thought about. And maybe some professions are thinking about it more than us. Maybe nobody's thinking about it. But somebody's got to think about it. And if we are a profession concerned with the things people do, maybe perhaps it should be us. Now, I spend my days trying to understand why people use life-threatening self-harm as a way of coping, why ending life is appealing, and why after attempting to end somebody's life, they are still alive. It's a really important thing to be able to understand. Now, I had no encouragement to do this whatsoever as an occupational therapist. I could ensure that somebody had life skills. I could assess their activities of daily living. I could consider whether they could live independently. I could assess what they wanted and needed to have a life worth living. But I couldn't really have an opinion on why they were still alive. The occupations that could have killed them, they were thought about by other professions, if at all. The occupations that had led to them being detained in hospital. And if you want to adapt somebody's environment to impact on their functioning, locking them in hospital against their will is a pretty seismic way to do that. The occupations that led to them being detained, they were again for some other profession to think about. So when people with their long-standing ways of coping had them taken away, I watched as they did more and more dangerous things to themselves, and they became less and less ready for OT. And I could only think about people becoming more ill, and there was never encouragement to think about how going from an environment where you had some autonomy to being in a place where everything dangerous was taken away, all your decisions were made for you. There was never an encouragement to think about how that change in environment might exacerbate some of the problems that people might have, particularly if they've had power and autonomy taken away in painful ways before. We just didn't think about how that change in environment might impact on people. And why is that? It's because we focused just on the person and we didn't think about the stuff going on around them. Now, whether people are right or not is another matter, but nobody saw any merit in me as an occupational therapist until I stopped being employed as an occupational therapist and went out into a different environment and started thinking about these things, and then these things being the primary part of my work. While I was an occupational therapist, it couldn't be done. When I stepped into a more generic role, then I could do it. And then people might start to think positive things about me in terms of my profession. And that's weird. It's weird that that was the journey that I went on. Now, there are some other things that can make environments more toxic. When Sir Simon Wesley was doing his review of the Mental Health Act, he talked about the amount of fear that lived within organisations and professional groups. He quoted people talking about how staff had stopped managing the risks to their patients and started managing the risks to themselves. If that patient does something, how will it affect me? So I will manage that risk, as opposed to thinking about what will give my patient the best chance of recovery and the best life that they can have. And why is that? Was because the consequences were massive. There would be a process where people would look for someone to blame or something to blame. The formal inquiries and scrutiny and castigation for something going wrong was awful, and people wanted to avoid it. But this is just an example of how in mental health, people are recognising that fear is there, and that fear is impacting on the way that people practice. But I'm sure that there's examples in physical health as well. I quite like this paper as well, where they're talking about how the things that our patients can do can become dangerous. Dangerous to them, but also dangerous to the staff. The staff can be blamed for what the patients do, and thus, without ever touching us, our patients can become dangerous. And if we see people as dangerous or threatening, we're not going to form the really close therapeutic relationships that we need to in order to be helpful. So we've got frightened staff working in a way that might serve the organisation and themselves a bit more than their patients. And as Russell Razak, who was leading a project in the Royal College of Psychiatrists, he kind of said recently that if patients designed the services that they were using, they'd probably look a lot different. And I think he's right. Chloe Beale earlier on mentioned that services sometimes almost seem designed to harm. And if they do, if as professionals we're witnessing services that undermine and are not useful at one end, but are actively harmful at the other end, what do we do about that? You know, if we do nothing, I think that really ramps up that sense of moral injury that Chloe was talking about. If we act, then how do we act? How do we prevent our patients from being harmed in environments that can be toxic to them? Now, this is an example from somewhere in England, where they were talking about the climate of fear really putting patients at risk. There were multiple adverse incidents in the one area, and people there were saying that if you try to raise it, that organisation would try and ruin your career. There was that idea of like, if you criticise senior management, they'll have you. And in that area, when people raised concerns, 26 doctors were referred to the General Medical Council, and 26 doctors were acquitted with no further action. And there was this real sense that being referred to the GMC was just a punishment for raising concerns. And maybe that's unique to that place, but that was my experience as well. I was in an organisation and I thought, what we are doing has harmed this person. We have been disingenuous, and we followed a plan that has really, really affected their life. And I was really scared about raising it. And I spoke to the union and I spoke to the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian before I did anything. And then I recorded it in the incident recording format. And then I heard nothing. And I waited a bit and I still heard nothing. And then I chased it up and I said, you know, is anything coming from it? And they said, oh, we think it's a HR issue. And I was like, oh, a HR issue? What does that mean? And they said, we'll phone you back. And they didn't phone back. But the thing that came was a senior manager came and said, you are going to be investigated for misconduct for what you have done. You are not to talk about this patient in the team. The team is not to talk about this patient anymore. And we spent 6 months investigating me and clearing me. I'll probably chuck that in for misconduct. And it's terrifying. It's terrifying to think that you are going to lose your reputation and livelihood. I remember kind of talking to the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian as it was happening. I said, you know, I put in this concern, and they've come back saying that you're being investigated. I think I'm suffering detriment for raising this concern. And they said, oh, I'm sorry you feel like that. I said, oh, that's not the support I was looking for. And again, you know, this might be a very isolated experience, but my experience raising concerns was it did absolutely nothing for the person I was concerned about. And I was worried about losing my job and reputation. And I think if that is the environment that is within our health service, that is going to breed clinicians that are quiet when people are being harmed. It's going to breed clinicians who follow the organisational line of protecting itself and protecting its reputation, as opposed to looking out for the best interests of our patients. And those are probably not the clinicians that we would want to meet when we walked into a place seeking help. Now, was my experience unique? Well, unfortunately not. The whistleblowing charity Protect, who I found quite useful in my experience of going through that, found that when people had a response to raising concerns, a lot of the time it was very punitive. So they found that people got dismissed quite quickly. So part of the reward for raising concerns about people being hurt is that you lose your job. And that seems to happen with alarming frequency. There were a lot of people who said that they feared a very punitive response, as I did, about trying to raise concerns. And the data here from Protect would suggest you are absolutely right to feel like that, because you probably will suffer. And this isn't what it should be like. And is this a problem? Obviously it is a problem, but what again happens here is that the person raises the issue and we focus on the person. We forget a bit more about what is going on around them. There is the problem and the person raising the problem, and the person raising it is more easily fixed. Okay, so is there other stuff that affects our relationship? Well, I think there is. So what else can make the environment hard? There is, again, that moral injury of really seeing people suffering. Now, I have never had to be part of a 40 ambulance queue to get into somewhere, but I can imagine that is appallingly difficult for ambulance drivers sat there while somebody's bleeding out in front of them. And you know, ambulance services are striking at the moment. For those not in the UK, a lot of our public services are kind of saying, "Oh, we just can't manage with what we've got at the minute." What is it like to be an emergency call handler, hearing emergencies coming and knowing that you can't get any help to people for hours on end? What is it like to know that conditions are not safe for your patients or your staff? What is it like to know that half of junior doctors are experiencing massive levels of stress and anxiety? But this is a lot less of what gets talked about in our media at the moment. What we hear is nurses want more money, doctors want more money, ambulance drivers want more money. But everybody who is striking at the moment is talking about the conditions that they are working with. And is that a bad thing? Yes, a bad thing, because if the environment is toxic, people will not want to stay in it. And they're not staying in it. So these are some statistics from the nursing and midwifery, the NMC. They surveyed their members to find out, why did 22,000 people leave in the 1 year? And like half of them retired, so fair enough. You know, maybe if things were different, they might not have retired, but half of them retired. But there was a lot of people talking about the pressure. There was a lot of people talking about the workplace culture. There was a lot of people talking about being disillusioned by the quality of care that they're able to give to their patients. So it's not just the money, there's elements within the work that is making people not want to stay. Is it just the nurses? It is not just the nurses. In 21 to 22, 13% of the NHS mental health workforce left. 13%. It's a massive number of staff not being there anymore. And this isn't happening at a time when supply and demand for the service, or demand for the service is easing off. This is at a time when people are desperate and really hammering at the doors of mental health services, and the staff aren't there. We've got 4 in 10 junior doctors planning to leave the NHS as soon as they can. They are striking today, as I am recording this, because of the conditions that they find themselves working in. The NHS is expected to have over 500,000 vacancies by 2036. And again, this isn't going to be an environment that meets the needs of every patient in there. And it's going to be hellish for staff working in it. It's going to be awful to look at the suffering around you, knowing that there is just this relentless queue of people in distress waiting to come through. And it's not just in health services as well. If we think about other public services in Britain, there's a third of England's teachers have left the profession, or a third of English teachers who qualified in the past 10 years have left for the profession. There is something about the work conditions that mean that people don't want to stay, so they don't. But we think about greedy individuals wanting more money, or we think about individuals who aren't resilient enough to do these testing jobs. And we think about those individuals, but we think less about the environment around them. So it might be that our whole society is thinking about individuals much more than what goes on around them. In Parliament, a health minister at the time was asked, what should staff do if they're on shifts and people are earning 3 times more of them than them as agency workers? Should they go on strike? Should they look for more pay? And he replied that, you should see your profession as the vocation that it is. But the problem is, in a market economy, traits like altruism, vocation, charity, they're commodities to be exploited. They have no value in the market economy. And the people offering them become seen more and more as worthless or not as important. We look at individuals and we don't look at the environment around them. And I think that something in society is going wrong. I think that our children growing up today, they might be seeing a bit less of A Brave New World and a bit more of 1984. And this is really problematic. If we think about some statistics that are out there, I'm saying something's going wrong. Is there some evidence for that? Well, our children might be the evidence. We've got a rise in teen suicides. We have got self-harm really going up. We've got other things such as the risk of dying by suicide is 7 times higher after you have self-harmed, in a year after you've self-harmed. So people are self-harming more. That's frightening. Because of the effect on suicide, that's even more frightening. If you've self-harmed, again, your risk of suicide goes up, but your risk of death goes up as well. And the terrifying statistic for me is that 1 in 50 people who go to A&E with self-harm will die by suicide in a year. And that's awful. That's awful in general, but it's awful because self-harm among children is rising. And why is that the case? Well, it could be that a lot of our children are ill. It could be that we have more ill and disordered children than ever before. And one of the articles that was on the BBC might back that up. Those who've got a probable mental health disorder are more likely to live in households where it's hard to pay the bills. You've got 2/3 of children with maybe an eating problem. 2/3! And you've got huge demand for services by children. I'm wondering if the chances of mental disorder is higher in places with poverty. Maybe it's the poverty. And if so many people have got problems, maybe it's not the individuals, maybe something else is going on. And if there is something else going on, and it's not more people becoming ill, I don't think this increase in mental health teams is going to be the answer, because the problem is not in those individuals themselves. We've got Piers Morgan, a multi-millionaire, telling us that actually everything's all right and we might have a generation of snowflakes. But I think the snowflakes are melting because we're living in conditions that are a bit more hellish. I think without the insulation of being a multi-millionaire, things actually feel quite hard. But, you know, I'm guessing, but what is it? Is it that it's greater inequality for children these days? Is it that children have got less chance of owning their own home? Is it that they've got less chance of being as successful as their parents? Is it that we have hypersexualized our children and allowed them to carry their school bullies home in their pocket? Is it that graphic material is available in a way that it never was when I was a child? Or is it that struggling is seen as a sign of moral failing, as being a snowflake, as opposed to conditions being different? Now, in this graph, they kind of mapped out the differences in inequality with social problems, and it will not amaze you to notice that the greater the social problems, the greater the inequality in society. You've got the USA winning at the top there, but the UK's not faring particularly well. A lot of the Western society is really struggling there. When rampant inequality is taking place, people struggle more. And what we are doing is we have services that respond to individual problems that may offer some help, but return people to the environments where those problems arose. Now, this isn't exclusive to my area of mental health. The Royal College of Occupational Therapists had Michael Marmot come to the conference a few years back, and he talked about how social differences are paramount in different areas of kind of health inequality. If we're poorer, we're more likely to get sick. If we're poorer, we are more likely to have difficulties in life. And that disparity between people who have and people who have not is very problematic. But maybe it'll get better. Maybe it'll get better. It isn't getting better though. We have embraced neoliberalism as a culture. We have embraced the idea that individuals are entirely responsible for their success or for their difficulties. And Andrew Carnegie talked about, you know, survival of the fittest is great because, you know, it ensures that the best people survive. But people aren't surviving. And the people who are not surviving are the people who are the most vulnerable. And as I gave the example earlier on, the people who seem to be at more risk of dying by their own hand than the previous generation are our children. Survival of the fittest comes at quite the cost. Now, maybe it'll get better, but it is not getting better. This is from British Medical Journal very recently, talking about how, for the first time in a long time, the gap between the richest and the poorest has grown. And this is a choice. This is a choice around the societies we live in. You know, and this isn't a call for, you know, the communist tanks to roll in, but it is a call to think about whether we need such disparity between the people who have everything and the people who have nothing. Now, there might be a sense that I've been asked to do this lecture today because there's something useful or good about me. But I think, again, that would be focusing on an individual. And I would be nothing without the people who have shaped and influenced me over my career. There has been a sense that everything useful I have got to say has been appropriated from survivors of trauma and services. And I think it was meant to be an insult, but I'm quite proud of the way that I've listened to people who have really challenged some of the things that I've thought and done. And all of those people there have really put me into a journey of doing this. And we will all have slides that we could put up like that of people who influence. We need to think about the environment around us and not so much about individuals. It's really important because there is us as individuals and there is everything else. And we are a profession that needs to be able to think about that. Now, I was asked to make sure that I gave a lecture that gave people hope. And maybe I haven't done that, but let's have a think. Let's have a think, because it's hard, isn't it? It's really hard. So we can't change the world. Can't change the world. Or can we? Can we change the world? Because isn't that what we do all the time when we adapt to physical environments? So can we bring a conviction that our relationships are the most important things in our practice and act as if that's the case? Can we identify the pressures of work and the organisation and how they take us away from the therapists we want to be and the therapists that our patients need? Can we be vocal when the conditions of work make it so bad that it's better not to be there? Can we help our patients while being clear that society is breeding the conditions that would cause misery and fear in most people? And if we can do that, will we do that? Will we own that expertise on the impact of the environment? And I think we will. I think we will, because we can see the need and we have that knowledge. I think we will because we have the responsibility and we have that role. I think we will because what we lack in power, we make up for in passion. And when we do that, what will you do? What will you do to make that change? So diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much for being with me today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. We'll do the Q&A now. Thank you for Leslie Roberts for making sure that my Welsh was on tap. And I hope that you can take something from this to do something different in the world. Let's do it. Let's change the world. Thank you very much.
Kier, thank you so much for that brilliant lecture. We have lots and lots of questions for you this evening rather. And so I'll start with the first one from Rachel. Rachel's asking, what needs to change within the training of occupational therapists to help us address some of the issues that you've raised in your lecture today? You're on mute, okay.
God, it's like the most high profile thing I do, and I come in and do that. What an idiot. Right, what can we do? I think my profession, again, it prepared me really well to work with people who were coming in, really knew what they wanted to be different, would be keen to take my advice and go off and use it in the world. And I wasn't prepared to work with people who had lived through multiple experiences of trauma and deprivation. So I don't think it has to be diagnosis focused, although for a point I did. I think we need to help staff think about some of the difficulties of accessing care and also the impact of that on us. It is so painful when you perceive people to be rejecting you. It is so painful when you are trying your best and it feels like things are getting worse. And if you can't talk about the impact of that, you'll end up acting it out in ways that are quite unhelpful. So I'd really want staff to come into work with a knowledge that I am going to find something difficult. It's not necessarily a failing in me, but I need to be able to articulate the emotional experience of what I'm going through. And I don't think I was very well prepared to do that. And I think that would be a large benefit to the next generation coming through.
Thank you, Kier. So the next question is from someone who didn't leave their name. It says, does a person have to fulfill all the criteria for borderline personality disorder in order to be diagnosed?
Okay, so to get a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, you need to hit 5 out of 9 criteria, according to the DSM manual. But we can kind of see that that's a bit ridiculous, because like if you've got 4 out of 9 criteria, you don't have a diagnosis. If you click and have that extra one, then you do. So it's a very binary move from not a diagnostic issue to suddenly you get that label. So I'd really encourage people to think about other ways of classifying distress rather than that.
Okay. Our next question is from Suzanne Hudson. Have you ever designed or used a risk assessment tool in your clinical practice? If you have, why? And if you haven't, why not?
Okay. These are quite quick fire, these questions, aren't they? I have used a range of different risk assessment tools over the years, I think. What I do now is I don't use a standardized tool. And I think the NICE guidelines tell us not to use standardized tools around risk assessment. I will really try and pick out the things that seem dangerous, certainly the things that organizations are worried about and react to in ways that are quite restrictive, and just try and make sense of it. The dialectical behavior therapy manual is quite good for breaking down dangerous things that people do into thoughts, urges, behaviors, emotions, and just looking at how one step leads to the other, to the other, to the other. And then you move away from, oh, that was a bad thing they did, they shouldn't have done that, to, oh, that makes sense given what happened, what they were thinking, what they were feeling. So that has been a really useful thing for me. We've got a bit of a structure to the formulations and assessments we do at the moment, but we're pretty flexible with it in terms of going wherever it seems most useful to try and understand. So yeah, the short answer is I have not designed a risk assessment. I've got a couple of ideas in my head that's most important, but I try and leave it a bit more organic in the work that I'm doing.
Okay. Our next question is from Gemma. And she said, I would love to see the kind of shift in challenge and stigma that we're seeing in our secondary care mental health services, in our primary care network mental health services. How do you think this can be achieved in primary care with many competing agendas and a stubborn attachment to the medical model?
That's a very good question, and one that I'm going to try and give an authoritative answer to, despite spending very little time working in primary care. But look at that, I'm going to have a go at it anyway. Probably the biggest thing for me around challenging stigma is working with people with lived experience. So having people with lived experience as part of those teams, so that having the problems is not located solely in the people receiving the service, it's located in the people delivering the service as well. And I think when you have less of that us and them, it's a lot harder to pathologize and blame the people that you're working with. You start to think a lot with a bit more nuance and complexity, because you are talking about your colleagues and your colleagues that you have a relationship with. So certainly working with lived experience, both in groups and in my clinical work now, has a massive effect on me, and it just doesn't let me think in the very stigmatized ways that I very much used to hold, as if there's something else. So yeah, lived experience with seniority and power in services just means that people will have a different experience of their difficulties than just having them as the people walking through the door looking for help.
Okay.
Other opinions are available.
Thanks, Kier. Our next question is from someone who didn't leave their name, but they'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how we can better prepare pre-registration students for the realities of the practice context in which you're describing.
Okay, well, you'd read one book that would say, don't let students work with the people I work with. As Alice said, that book's not available to purchase anymore. How do we prepare students? Well, I think there is something about trying to prepare students for the reality of the work. And I think the moral injury that Chloe Beale described, and I hinted at a lot in the presentation, was around seeing things that don't fit with our values, but having to go along with it. So I would really encourage our next generation to be quite candid about environments that cause harm. Somebody asked me a very similar question once about how do we build resilience in people going forward, and I don't think we should be building resilience for conditions that the majority of people would find intolerable. I think people are leaving professions and public services for a reason, and we can shout about it and we can blame them, or we can think about how these services should change. And these services will change if people who are experts in the environment and how environments impact on functioning can be vocal about those environments and take those observations and opinions into forums where change can occur. And that might be in organizations, that might be politically, that might be in a range of areas. But if we don't talk about it, then things might stay the same. Things might get worse. We need to talk about the things that impact on people.
Thank you, Kier. So staying on the question of environments, we have a question from Farah, and she asks, I wanted to ask about environmental safety and the people that you're working with feeling safe. Do you ever ask explicitly, do you feel safe in this environment? And how do you factor environmental safety into your planning?
Do I ever ask if people feel safe? I probably not like that, because I think my default is often that people generally don't feel safe. If I am going into an acute ward and people are shouting and there's just a little feeling of chaos, generally I don't feel safe. And I'm pretty chunky, you know. It's not an environment I feel comfortable. And then I think about if I was forced to live here with people I'm not choosing to live with, and I'm not able to do the things that I would normally do to manage distress, I don't think I'd feel safe. So I bring in the assumption that people aren't feeling safe. If they are, generally there's not any difficulties to work on. And then in terms of, I can't remember the second part of the question, Adef, do you want to help me?
So the second part was about, have you asked them explicitly if they felt safe, and how do you factor environmental safety into your planning?
Okay. So environmental safety can probably come in a couple of different ways. I think sometimes people think you make environments safe by taking away everything that can possibly be dangerous. And when we follow that to its logical conclusion, we keep people safe by putting them in rip-proof clothing, in bare rooms, generally with a lot of chemicals to calm them down. And, you know, while that might make the organization and staff feel safe, it's not really the road to recovery. You know, you can't keep people like that until their self-esteem improves or until they start developing autonomy. It's a kind of, it often kind of replicates people having power taken away early in their lives. So we want to try and bring safety largely through the relationships that we have. We want to bring emotional safety by letting people know that they can talk to us about things, that we will listen and respond, that we will validate rather than judge, that we will solve problems around dangers and risks together rather than tell them what they need to do. And that isn't for everyone, but, you know, like if we're taking somebody out of hospital and everybody's worried that they'll run away, rather than not take them, we'll say, are you going to run away? Tell you what, if you run away, I probably won't be able to take you out again. And, you know, I don't know if we'll be able to kind of carry on doing the work that we're doing. But if you tell me that you're not, I'll trust you on that. And that is a way of managing risk. It probably doesn't come with the same sense of comfort as not opening the door in the first place. But again, we cannot brutalize people into recovery. We have to give autonomy to people. because that's generally what they want, and it can't be about our needs rather than theirs.
Thank you, Kier. So the next question is from Ellie Babcock, and Ellie's asking whether you can speak about the difficulty of cultivating environments where patients can thrive within the NHS when NHS staff are underpaid, overworked, and underappreciated. And she wondered how we can work together to change the political landscape on NHS pay and conditions, and whether you had any thoughts.
Okay, so the stuff about within the NHS, I think I'd be an absolute fraud if I tried to answer that question, because I am somebody who stepped out of the NHS, partly because of some of the experiences I described earlier on, and partly because I couldn't be seen as having any expertise within the role I had within it. So yeah, there's something about that environment that meant it wasn't a good fit for me at that time. Maybe in terms of kind of the wider society and the more political environment around us, you know, we're not a very political profession. You know, I don't see many of us stepping into roles where we can not just adapt the environment of our individual clients, but can we adapt the environment of society a bit more? We probably have to get a bit more political about that. And if not overtly political in the sense of being elected into office, how can we shape our politicians? So I write to my MP and representative every now and then. If I see something in the media that I think I've got a useful opinion on, I might either write into the letters page, or I might try and get hold of the journalist and say, you know, I've got some stuff that we can follow up on this. And it is about, if we're thinking our opinion is not being heard there, our professional voice is absent from what's being talked about, let's do something to get it talked about. And it doesn't come easily. I've tried to get the BBC to talk about this lecture. Utterly fails. Utterly fails. But I tried. You know, and there's a lot of rejection in that. But you know, the next person who tries, they'll probably do better, because there's more of us than ever before taking this message out into the world. And perhaps what we are doing right here, right now, perhaps that is a catalyst for getting more occupational therapy thought into the world that is out there.
We've got less than 3 minutes left, Kier, and I'm going to squeeze the last question in. So have you ever used mentalization-based treatment, MBT, in your practice? And if so, have you found it useful?
Hey, I have not used mentalization-based treatment. I have interviewed Anthony Bateman, who is the creator of MBT alongside Peter Fonagy, and I have a lot of time for it, because I think being able to understand what goes on in our heads and being able to recognize our thoughts means that we can choose whether we act on them or not. And certainly the idea of mentalization and thinking about what other people think and what we think about that, I think it's really important. There's a lot of thinks in there. It's really important in terms of really trying to understand why the people do what they do. I think a lot of my work is about trying to create empathy and understanding around what people do, which is a very conscious thing that I have to do sometimes in environments that are quite risky and scary. But you know, I probably use elements of MBT without ever having gone off and done formal training on that. If anybody wants to send that training, I'm very up for it.
That concludes our question and answer session, Kier. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
We appreciate your very candid
so
answers. You are very welcome. So, on behalf of the Elizabeth Casson Trust and the Royal College of Occupational Therapists, I just want to say a really big thank you. But before I do that, I just want to reflect a little bit on the lecture we've just heard this afternoon. So Kier he spoke a lot about moral injury. That's such a huge topic, and something that we all need to sort of be mindful of due to the fact that we've just come out of the pandemic, but also some of the environments that we work in. And as Kier put it so wonderfully in his lecture, you know, those environments do prevent us from thriving. And we do have a duty of care as occupational therapists to ensure that the environments that we're placing our patients and our clients in will enable them to thrive. And so he spoke again about the impact on the future generations and our children coming up, and the fact that, you know, we're probably cultivating a generation of children who are probably not going to be as resilient as some of the previous generation, and what we need to be thinking of in terms of being occupational therapists and how we're going to provide therapy for this group of children coming up. There's lots to reflect on. There's some little nuggets around resilience, but more importantly, it spoke about our responsibility as therapists to be able to build those therapeutic relationships so that we can be effective within our therapy. And I think that's one of the nuggets that I will take away from this lecture. Of course, there's lots of, the lecture will be on our website. For those who are joining us virtually, for those who are going to view it afterwards, it will be on our website. So on behalf of the Royal College of Occupational Therapists and the Elizabeth Casson Trust, we'll be sending you, Kier, a special token, an acknowledgement that you're joining the esteemed group of Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecturers. And so that will be in the post to you shortly. I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for giving us such a wonderful lecture. You've outlined the warts and all in terms of what some of our environments are like and the impact it has on our patients. And you've also reminded us of our duty as therapists to advocate on behalf of our patients. So just a reminder for everyone who are tuning in, you'll be able to view the written details of Kier's lecture in his article in the British Journal of Occupational Therapy. And final reminder is for the 2024 Elizabeth Casson lecture, you can nominate an OT to deliver that lecture. Do you know someone who's made a difference or is making a difference to our profession? You can nominate them to give next year's Elizabeth Casson lecture. There's information on our website, so if you need additional information, please go to our website. It is now time to say thank you to the 1,372 people who have joined us online tonight, and to say to the 3,500 who've registered who may be watching the lecture later on, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us. A special thank you to Alice and Chrissy. It's a very special thank you to our technical team for ensuring that the lecture ran smoothly this afternoon, and for all those members of staff at the Royal College of OT who's worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this lecture a success. Last but not least, thank you, Kier, for taking the time to deliver this lecture for us. We appreciate it. Thank you all and good night.